if you only focus on the negative aspects of people, you're never going to find anyone in the world that you like, because everyone, even the best person in the world, has flaws, and they do bad things and they do wrong things. And so, you're gonna have to come to terms with that. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. What is a mentor? A mentor is basically someone who you look up to, right? You can say another word for a mentor is a role model, someone who you want to be like, someone who gives you something to aim at. And mentor, specifically the word mentor, it carries the connotation of someone who's able to actually teach you and guide you along the way, right? At least for me, when I think of mentor, I think of someone in the workplace, maybe a boss or someone who has more experience than you, that's sort of mentoring you, that's guiding you, that's pushing you along in the right direction. And so that's sort of what mentor carries in terms of a connotation. A role model carries, I guess, more of a connotation that we just emulate them, right? That there might not be some dialogue between us, but they're a role model, someone who we aspire to be like. But they're almost interchangeable terms, of course, mentor and role model. And why do we even have mentors? Why do we even have role models? Well, the simplest answer is because we want something to aim at in terms of our own self-improvement, right? If we give a damn about getting better in life at anything, it's very helpful to have sort of some idea of how to actually get there, something to aim at. And so if we have a mentor, if we have a role model, it gives us a real life living example of something that we can aspire to be like. And that's good. It's good to have something to aim at. I mean, after all, if you don't know what you're aiming at, it's going to be very unlikely that you're actually going to hit the target, right? It's certainly going to be near impossible for you to stumble upon whoever you want to be like. And so if you want to be great at something, or great in life, or successful, you need something to aim at. And that's why we have mentors. That's why we have role models. So if they can guide us one-on-one, it's a lot better, right? It's even better because we can get direct feedback. They can sort of change our perspective on ourselves. It's very, the best type of mentor is one who you can actually engage with on a one-to-one basis, not someone that you find, online or in a book. It's good to have that helpful. It's good to have people that, that you aspire to be like, but that you can't talk to, but it's also really beneficial to have someone who can actually communicate with you. You can actually have dialogue, and dialogue is where a lot of epiphanies are had, a lot of learning is had, and a lot of growth, of course, is had. But do you want a mentor or a god? And that's a weird question, right? What the hell does that mean? Well, my high school teacher once said something along the lines of, he was joking, of course. It's a little bit of a morbid statement, but he said, and I quote, "The only time anyone appreciates you is when you're dead." And that's morbid, I know. And he was joking a little bit, but come on, every joke has some speckle of truth, of course, right? Now think about it. Do you tend to respect people more from the past or people that are alive today? It's definitely something worth considering, and I'll give you an example here. I've found on my own channel on Instagram, I share a lot of quotes. I share a lot of ideas that I discuss throughout each podcast episode. And I've found that generally speaking, I tend to get more engagement with those quotes, those posts that reference someone else, specifically someone else that is no longer alive. For example, Marcus Aurelius quotes get lots of likes. Carl Jung quotes gets lots of likes. My own content, sometimes they do really well, sometimes they don't, but it does seem to be, as soon as you see those quotation marks and a name underneath, and especially someone who's well respected and well known from the past, it seems to give you that idea that, oh, this must be a great idea. It's a very interesting phenomenon. We seem to appreciate ideas from people who are now dead, and I've been thinking about that. Why is that? Why is that the case? Why do we tend to respect people more that are dead? And my hypothesis is because we deify them. We in our heads, we make them gods because they're no longer living, they're dead, they're deceased, and we see them as these perfect individuals. We see them as these gods. And I'll explain what that means a little bit later. Because basically, people are flawed, right? People are flawed. Human beings are flawed. But guess what? Gods are not. Gods are not flawed. Gods are perfect. In fact, a deity is literally an ideal. It's if you think of someone like Buddha, for example, or Jesus Christ, these are examples, in fact, perfect examples on how that specific religion wants you to behave. It's an ideal. It's a perfect embodiment of all the values that you hold dear, specifically the religion that you are following holds dear. And so gods are not flawed, but people are flawed. And so when someone is alive, when someone is living, and you hear them talk and you read their writing, you're going to notice that they have imperfections. You're going to notice that they have flaws, that they make mistakes sometimes. Sometimes they say things that they don't mean. Sometimes they say things that they do mean that are just really ignorant or arrogant or rude or mean. And that makes you sort of not like them as much because you're seeing their inherent flaws. You're seeing their imperfections. And you have to deal with that, right? For example, let's put aside all sort of celebrities or anything like that. What about your boss, right? Maybe your boss is near perfect. He's great. He's a great mentor. He guides you. He knows, he's very knowledgeable and he can teach you all the technical stuff that you need to know. But every now and then he's in this terrible, terrible mood and he talks down to you and, he makes you feel belittled. It makes you feel like a little person. And it's not very often. But it happens every now and then. Well, what are you going to do? For those few hours that he has belittled you and you have to deal with that in your head, you probably don't like the guy. You probably hate the guy. And again, that's because you're dealing with an imperfection of his. You are dealing with one of his flaws. And so for those few hours, you're going to hate the guy. You're not going to like him. You're going to be seething. But then years later, when you've left this job and went on to a new, better job, or maybe after he retires and you have his job, you're going to look back on that. You're going to look back on him and say, "Wow, that guy! Like he was the best mentor I ever had. He was so great." And you're not going to realize those little tiny imperfections, especially, I hate to say it, but after he's gone, after you're no longer able to actually communicate with him, you sort of deify him in your head, and maybe sometimes you'll think about that terrible thing that he said every now and then, but generally speaking, you're to consider him a great mentor, a great person. You're going to think of them as people who don't make mistakes. And I think the very same thing happens when someone dies, right? And it's especially if it's someone we've never met. It's true with people we've met as well. I'm sure people that that have passed on, that have died, and you appreciate them more. You appreciate the things that they've done for you. You appreciate their personality, their little quirks, even their flaws. I mean, especially their flaws. You appreciate those things that maybe drove you kind of crazy when you actually when they were actually alive and you were spending time with them. But if it's someone that you've never met at all, such as Marcus Aurelius, such as Seneca, such as Carl Jung, it's very easy for us to deify them because, well, we don't want to see their flaws. We don't want to see them as flawed human beings. We want to see them as gods. We want to see them as these perfect beings. And perhaps this is one of the areas where the idea of God actually came from. And I mentioned Jesus Christ earlier, but the Buddha is another example. The Buddha is sort of seen as this, he found enlightenment and he was just in utter peace all of the time. And of course, as human beings, it's very hard for us to obtain that. In fact, I would argue that it's near impossible to obtain that for the simple fact alone that we are flawed and imperfect. And so the God is sort of this perfect embodiment of that. And maybe that's where it comes from. It's like, okay, well, someone such as Marcus Aurelius, who died so long ago, he had all these great values and he's done a lot of great things. And guess what? He did a lot of terrible things too. But in our heads, we think of him as a god because, well, we want to deify him. We want to use him as a role model. And we don't want to consider the fact that, well, he had inherent flaws, which of course he did. And I don't want to talk bad about Marcus Aurelius on this podcast. But if you do want to look into some of the things he's done, you'll find very quickly that there's things that he's done that was very morally and ethically questionable. And Meditations, the book that he wrote, was really a journal to himself, and he talked a lot about morality he talked a lot about mortality, about dying, about fearing death and coming to terms with death, and he wrote this continuously. It was a recurring theme throughout the whole Meditations, and what's interesting is that people read that and they say, okay, yes, these words are going to alleviate the fear of death, but you got to remember, Marcus Aurelius wrote this stuff for himself. He was trying to convince himself this as much as anyone else. And so it's not like he was perfect. It's not like he perfectly embodied this mentality. No, of course. He was struggling with it. He struggled with it a lot. And that's why he had to write about it so much. And so, I don't want to go too deep into a rabbit hole with Marcus Aurelius, but the point I'm trying to make here is that people in the past who have written just great books and really great people who have accomplished amazing things, and that we can read and learn about them today, which is utterly amazing. But these people, they were still people. They were still flawed. They were imperfect. They screwed up, I'm sure, a lot. And, sure, we only see the great things that came through from them a lot of times. And some people point out the bad things that they've done. And, I'm not saying we should focus on those bad things, but we should accept the fact that these people were human beings. They weren't gods. They weren't perfect. And so the expectation for ourselves to be perfect is sort of a dumb thing. And so, moral of the story, our mentors are flawed. We have all these great people that we aspire to be like, and yet they are all inherently flawed. And what do we do about that? What do we do? Like, how can we deal with that? Because, as I mentioned before in several of my episodes, is that the flaws that we have as human beings and the imperfections in the world, that is something that is very hard for us to deal with. It's very difficult because we want things to be perfect. We want to be happy all the time. We want our work to be enjoyable all the time. We want our relationships to be happy and loving and romantic all the time. We want that desperately, but it's not going to happen. It's because we don't live in heaven. We live on planet Earth. This is life. And so, to ask for something like that, you're asking way too much. But how do we deal with that? Specifically on the mentor side, how do we deal with flawed mentors? Well, years ago, an acquaintance of mine, or I suppose a friend of mine, posted something online asking how everyone else deals with this. How do you deal with learning horrible things about people they admire? And he had some celebrity examples, one such being John Lennon. John Lennon, who was a leading member of the Beatles. If you don't know John Lennon, go look him up now. But he wrote just wonderful music, beautiful, beautiful music, and was really well respected. And, I think he leaned too much on the socialist communist side, and for my particular liking. But, I definitely resonate with a lot of his messages. I mean, I think fundamentally we all want to believe in sort of the socialist communist ideals and aspects, but it doesn't work out in practice. Anyways, don't want this to be about communism. But moral of the story is John Lennon was a role model of his. He really appreciated it. He really appreciated him as a person and what he spoke for and what he said. And then he found out one day, he used to abuse his girlfriend. He used to abuse her. He used to, smack her up a little bit. And as an individual, my friend, he had a lot of trouble dealing with this because he's thinking to himself, okay, well, Jesus, here's this person that I really admire, that I want to be like, I'm trying to be like. And then here he is abusing someone he loves and cares about. And obviously that's a horrible thing. I mean, clearly no one should, abuse their partner at all. But, he stated how disheartening it was for him to learn such things. And that was one of the examples, John Lennon. There's literally an unlimited amount of examples because there are an unlimited amount of mentors that we have, and they have an unlimited amount of flaws. And so, there's so many examples. But he was struggling with this, and this is something that we all struggle with, right? But really, if you think about that mentality, what is that mentality really saying? Well, he's saying that one single act, or maybe it's a reoccurring act, of evil outweighs the acts of any amount of good. Meaning if you do one bad thing, or if you have a bad habit, that is going to outweigh all the good that you do in the world. If you think about that, that's clearly ridiculous, right? It's clearly ridiculous. Like, think about it like this. Like, if your partner called you an asshole one night because you guys got into a fight and things got heated, are you going to no longer want to be with them? Are you going to basically only focus on that for the rest of the relationship, or are you going to try and forgive them for that? Or are you going to try and focus on the good aspects and realize that there's a lot of good there as well? That, yeah, there's some bad. I mean, no one likes to be called an asshole. But at the end of the day, that's only one little tiny aspect of the relationship. And maybe the rest of it is good. Maybe most of it is good. And you get this little bit of bad in there, which is clearly going to happen all the time. So how would you deal with something like that? I mean, it's the same way. So now, granted, there are there's varying levels of evil. Some are worse than others. Some acts of evil are far worse than others. However, what I'm sure Carl Jung, who is a psychologist, very famous psychologist, I'm sure he would say something like, well, the degree of which an act is evil can be counterbalanced by the degree of good that they do. Something like that. And basically what I think he would say is that, and to I guess dumb it down a little bit, is what he's trying to say, or what I'm trying to say that I think he would say, is that, you have people that do great things and they do wonderful things. And in order for them to actually do those great things, there has to be a balance to that. There has to be another side. And so the capacity to do really great things, such as what John Lennon was able to do, sometimes it's almost like a requirement for the scales to tip, and that they have the capacity as well to do a lot of evil things. And so the capacity to do good is reflective of the capacity to do evil. Now, that's not to say that you are going to do good or do evil. You can only do mostly good, or you can only do mostly bad, but it's the capacity. It's like, okay, how much good can you do? Well, maybe that's dependent on how much evil you are able to do, and that's a Carl Jungian idea right there. And so there's a couple quotes here I'd like to share, and I quote, "The tree that would grow to heaven must send its roots to hell." And that's from Nietzsche, very famous philosopher. And what he's trying to say there is like, listen, if you have a tree and you want it to reach the ultimate good, which is really what heaven represents in religious texts, if you want a tree that's going to reach the ultimate good, the roots of the tree has to go down to evil. It has to go down to the most evil, the most terrible thing that you can imagine. And Carl Jung has a similar quote, and I don't know if he actually probably got this from Nietzsche or not, but he said, and I quote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Basically the exact same quote. So I don't know who said it. I'm sure probably Nietzsche said it first, I'm sure, because Nietzsche is a lot older. He's from the 18th century, I believe. And Carl Jung is from the 1900s. Nietzsche is from the 1800s, I do believe. But basically that's the idea, is that for a soul to be capable of really great things, it has to reach down to hell, meaning it has to at least understand the fundamentals of evil and be capable of that same amount of evil. Now, of course, you're a conscious person. You can choose to do mostly good, but that doesn't change the fact that you also have the capacity to do a lot of evil. And so what if, for humans, not for gods, the amount of good one can do in the world is in direct proportion to the amount of evil one can do in the world? The amount of evil one can do, not the amount of evil one chooses to do. And so how do we deal with this? Let's get back to the question here. How do we deal with flawed mentors? Well, remember first, if you were to only admire people who are perfect, who never do anything wrong, who never make mistakes, who never do any amount of evil, you're basically going to admire no one, because nobody is perfect, because we live in a very flawed world. And listen, if you only focus on the negative aspects of people, you're never going to find anyone in the world that you like, because everyone, even the best person in the world, has flaws, and they do bad things and they do wrong things. And so, you're going to have to come to terms with that. Except the fact that choosing to only admire people that are not flawed is choosing to admire nobody. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is learning to recognize both the good and the bad in the people, and abstract out what is good. Don't imitate someone. Don't completely copy and paste someone else's personality, but try and act out the values that they act out that you actually enjoy. Or, for example, if it's humility, maybe you can act out humility. Maybe they become prideful sometimes. Well, try not to act the prideful part out. You don't have to copy paste someone's personality. Take out the good and try and leave behind the bad. Maybe your boss is great at managing, so you learn managing from him. But maybe he's not so kind. Maybe he's a little rude. Maybe he's ignorant. Maybe you can learn kindness from your mother. Maybe you can learn it from someone else. And so don't assume that anyone living today or in the past, in fact, especially in the past, is perfect, because they are not. Recognize that people don't have to be perfect for you to learn from them. And thank you very much for listening. I hope it was a meaningful episode for you. If you can do one thing for me, share this episode with a friend, someone who would find it meaningful. Other ways you can support me is on Instagram. Check me out there at The Strong Stoic, or on my Facebook page at The Strong Stoic. I'm also on Twitter, Strong Stoic. Again, find me everywhere there. And that is it for today, guys. Thanks again. Cheers. Until next time.